Okay, we are back again. We are this week in the 5th chapter of 2nd Samuel. And as usual and as necessary, let's start with prayer. So, Lord, thank you for tonight. Thank you for all that are here. Thank you for all who will be listening. And we lift up this time. We set it apart each week as a special time to fellowship, sing, and also obviously here learn your word. Please, Holy Spirit, be with us and guide my words and make them come true in our own understanding and our own lives. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, if you will turn to 2 Samuel chapter 5. This is a very interesting chapter. And the reason why it's so interesting, and I hope I'm able to make it clear enough as I teach this tonight, is this is the beginning of a huge transition that occurs in Israel. This starts the beginning of a united monarchy, okay? And it also starts a very, very important event, and that is the ability or the time in which Israel finally gains possession of Jerusalem. So we need to talk about a bunch of things tonight as we go through these verses. There's a lot, and I've got maps. Matter of fact, should have passed them out. If someone would pass maps out, so at least they're right there, every other person could or so have a map. I marked them in numbers that we'll look at 1, 2, and 3. I'm trying to give you a picture of this place, especially when we talk about Jerusalem, because as I'm going to go through, Jerusalem has a very, very ancient history, way before Israel is there. And obviously, for many, many reasons, I'm sorry, Jerusalem, I was saying, and because for many, many reasons, Jerusalem is an extremely important place. So I'm going to start by talking for a minute and clarifying something. And that is, we use the term Israel, right? The problem with using the term Israel is that over time, Israel means different things. Okay, so I'm going to go through some of those things for you that it means. So, first of all, and if you, I'll go there, you don't have to go there, but I'm going to go to Genesis 32, and I'm going to read a verse. It's verse 28. This is the time starting in verse 22 of Genesis 32, where Jacob, quote unquote, wrestles with the angel of the Lord. Okay? He is allowed to prevail, but he comes out of it with an injured hip as a result. Now, as a result of this, he is renamed. Verse 28. And the angel of the Lord said, your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. So there's a spiritual change that occurs in Jacob, and as a result of that, he's called Israel. That's one meaning, obviously, of the verse. Now, secondly, we know that Jacob ends up having 12 sons, right? And as a result of those 12 sons, that he is the patriarch of a clan originally of 70 individuals. And we call that clan of Jacob's also, including these 12 people that will end up being developed into 12 tribes, we call that Israel. Now, we know that in history that this clan of 70, because of a famine that occurs, they move to Egypt, right? And they're given a welcoming, a very surprised welcoming by one of their own brothers, Joseph, who, as we know, has become, through God's provision, the chancellor or the right-hand man, as it were, to Pharaoh. And what happens, of course, is that they are brought in as a clan of around 70. Joseph provides them a territory in Egypt called Goshen, and they live for over 400 years in Goshen. Now, it's a very interesting thing, because if you go back to, the 12th chapter, for instance, of Genesis, where does God promise he's going to have them? What land is he going to give them? Well, not in Genesis 12.
Land of milk and honey.
Well, he's going to give them, quote unquote, Canaan, right? Where obviously Abraham has to move to. And so this is the land, and he has Abraham go all around it. And yet, interestingly enough, he then has them move out of it, okay, into Egypt. And then partway through this 400 years, we don't know exactly where, but they become so numerous, we estimate by the end of that time, there are about 2 million or so. They become so numerous that Pharaoh, a Pharaoh down the line in the dynasty, feels threatened by them and enslaves them. So they're now if you want to put it, a slave nation, but they have no real national entity or understanding. They're slaves. They don't have prescribed leaders. They don't have prescribed laws. They don't function as a nation. Does that make sense? Okay. Then, of course, God, we know next step, says it's time to leave. And he raises up Moses. Moses comes there. And of course, we have the time that he had the 10 plagues occur. And finally, at the end of it, Pharaoh concedes, at least for a while, to let them go. They finally do leave the land. And they then come into this territory that's actually northwest Saudi Arabia, okay, which is called the wilderness. And they're there, and they end up, they're there initially, as we know, for about 10 months or so-ish, where they're given a law, right? Where they're given a leader, where they're broken down into tribal leaders, where they're given customs. The beginning of the Torah occurs and its writing, the 10 Commandments. Okay, now they really begin to have elements of a national identity at this point. So after the 4 years, of course, and they're called together, they're called Israel. Okay. Now they function pretty much as a nation. They then are led eventually by Joshua into the conquest, going back finally into the territory that they've been out of for over 430 years, interestingly. God says it's time to go back. So they're led back. They are made into an army. That's another national entity or experience or expression. And over a 7-year period, they have a conquest of this territory over the Canaanites, and they effectively take the land, not completely. And towards the end of this period, God says, all right, I'm going to place you in the land. And he, through a lottery, he places them, these 12 tribal units, into different parts. So now they go from a fairly unified nation under Joshua to 12 tribal entities. And as time goes on, they become clearly less unified. They function as tribes and clan units. So then we go through the book of the Judges, and we see they're not at all unified, right? They don't function at all as a nation. And as a result, We know that there's wars that occur and people come into this territory and they have to have, quote, saviors, judges that are brought to overcome these people. So eventually, we see that they come to the point during 1 Samuel, as we studied, where they finally are given a king and they have a national entity as a king, but it's not really a very unified national entity. It's still a bunch of tribes that agree to have a king leader, but even though it's a monarchy, there's no capital. Okay, I mean, it still lacks a lot of nationhood characteristics. Of course, Saul eventually dies. During the process of his kingship, we learn, of course, that he's going to be deposed by God himself, and a new guy is going to take over, right? David. And of course, we see in several places in the Old Testament, it's promised he would be the king. And as a result of that, eventually, after Saul dies, we just studied one of the fourth son of Saul takes over as king, Ishbosheth, who is not a very good king and is really just a kind of a puppet ruler. The real force, of course, is the military leader, Abner, as we've studied. But Abner is killed, right? We studied that. Ishbosheth is assassinated. We just studied that. And then we come to essentially where we are as we start in the first verse of 2 Samuel 5. So all I want to show you is Israel means different things in different contexts over different periods of time. Now we're going to study what is really going to become for the first time a true national entity called Israel, unified under one king. Okay. So, as I said, the context used of Israel could refer to first originally a patriarch, okay, Jacob's rename. It then could refer to 10 northern tribes that were called Israel, okay. It then could refer in a different context to 12 tribes that take the whole land, or it could also refer to the land area that is occupied by the Jews called Israel. It can mean all those things. So I won't get into it, but Gary and I have got into this study about also when you look at what do the 12 tribes mean? Well, sometimes they're 12 tribes. Sometimes they're named as 13 entities. They change depending on the context and what God is trying to show in that context there. So now let's read verses 1 through 5. We're going to kind of get through verse 8 tonight. So I may be getting a award for the fewest number of verses to cover, but as we read them, I think you're going to agree that there's a whole lot of territory, geography, geology, and places that if I've got to describe to you, or it's really not going to make any sense to you what's going on in this chapter. Okay, so it's going to take us a little while to do that. So it says, and all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron, and they said, behold, we are your bone and your flesh. Previously, Saul was king over us, and you were the one who led Israel out and in. And the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people, Israel, and you will be ruler over Israel. So all the leaders of Israel came to Hebron, came to make him king at Hebron. And King David made a covenant with them before the Lord at Hebron. So they anointed David king over Israel. You see how the different usages are actually used there? He says that the elders came of Israel. What does he mean? The 10 northern tribes in the north. And then they come to make David king over Israel, which means a different thing. It means a unified, the whole country. You see why I'm telling you this, okay? All right. So, and it says they anointed David king over Israel. Verse 4, David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. Verse 5, and at Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Israel he reigned 33 years over all of Israel. Okay, now let's go through these because there's some things to describe to you in the process. All right, now, as we said, Ishbosheth is dead. All the representatives from all 12 tribes come to Hebron. And of course, they acknowledge a number of things. The first of all is that they have a common heritage, that they're related to each other. It's verse 1. Behold, we are your bone and your flesh. In other words, even though they've been divided up into 12 territories, they acknowledge we're still one genetic nation, people, okay? And you're as much a part of it as us, even though we've been divided up all this time. So the elders acknowledge 4 things, interestingly, at this point. Number 1, David is the king of Judah. He's already a king, right? Number 2, as we said, they are biologically related to him. Number 3, they recognize that David, under the reign of Saul, was already a national hero and a tested military commander. This is what is meant by the phrase, you are the one who led Israel out and in. In other words, in and out of trouble, in and out of difficulties with other nations. Because remember, under Saul's reign, David was the top military commander. Okay? Head of this group that met each month to talk about tactics and politics and all that was going on there. So they acknowledged this. And they said, obviously, they also admitted that for many years they knew, because of Samuel, that David was meant to be ultimately the king over all Israel. You don't have to turn here, but we find that in 1 Samuel 13:14, where this is promised. We also see it in 1 Samuel 15, verse 28, and we see it a third time in 1 Samuel 16:13. All of those are references that David would ultimately be made king and Saul would not be king. So they acknowledge that, these tribal leaders. Now, as I said, even though David was promised to replace Saul and to be king, it obviously didn't occur quickly. And we know that from what we studied in 1 Samuel. You know, he's chased for probably at least 8 years on the move with his militia all over the place, with Saul trying to kill him. So it doesn't occur right away at all. Now, in verse 3, we see that David agrees to make a covenant or an oath or a contract, and he, quote, accepts their proposal. Okay? They come to propose this entity occur, this kingship be given to him, and he agrees to it. Some people believe, and some commentators believe, and I'd be tempted to agree with them, that they also are in this implying that David will follow the Torah law about kings. We read that in Deuteronomy. Do you want me to read it again? Or it's in Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 through 20. It sets out the criteria for what a king would be, because during this time, they keep crying out, we want a king. All the nations have a king. We want a king. And of course, the Lord warns them and says, okay, but if I do this, here's what should be, and here's what's gonna be. And he says, that the king shouldn't accumulate wives to himself. Well, we know that's broken real quickly. David's already broken it, okay, at this point. We know that he's not supposed to accumulate a large stable of horses and this type of cavalry military. There's other things that basically he's supposed to obey elements of the Torah law. This is probably what is agreed to somewhat here. So it states in verse 4 that David is age 30 and becomes king then over all of Israel and reigns for 40 years. Now, notice something. Some people would say this is a contradiction in the Bible. It's not a contradiction in the Bible. But notice what verse 5 says. And Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem he reigned over 33 years over all Israel and Judah. Therefore, if you add that together, technically, he was king for how long? 40 and a half years. Because he reigned over Judah for 7.5 years. Now, why is it that it on the one verse says 30 years and 40 years, and why is it in the next verse that says 7.5 years and 33 years? Well, there's a purpose, okay? And let me try to explain the purpose. These are the things that we need to look into because they're not a contradiction. They're like the rabbi said, they're a remiz. They're kind of a apparent contradiction that's a mystery that if you look into it, you're going to understand a lot more information. All right. So age 30, traditionally, all through the history of Israel, and again, we're going to look at numerology, biblical numerology here. 30 meant the age of maturity, of full adult stature. And later on, it became the minimum age for which a man could become a rabbi. Age 30. Okay. Now, interestingly, we see that, and keep your place here. I need you to turn in the New Testament to Luke 3. So, Luke chapter 3, and I want you to see this. I want you to see how, again, what is begun in the old is finished in the new, as we've said over and over and over again. It's a unified Bible. It's not really, in that sense, two testaments, like they're different somehow. Okay, they aren't. So we're going to look at the third chapter of Luke, and we're going to look at verse 23. Okay, Luke 3:23. And when Jesus began his ministry, Jesus himself was about 30 years of age, being supposedly the son of Joseph, the son of Eli. You know why it said supposedly? Because he wasn't biologically related to Joseph. Okay? He was biologically related to Mary. He was biologically related to the Holy Spirit, if you want to put it that way. Okay? Now, so let's look at then 40. What about this number 40? Well, 40 frequently refers biblically to a generation period or to a particular era, or oftentimes it refers to the fullness of a time. For instance, let's give some obvious examples. So how long do they end up in the wilderness wandering? 40 years. Okay. Let's give another example in the New Testament. Okay. What happens in, I think it's John 4, when Jesus is tempted? He spends how long?
40 days.
40 days before he ended up being tempted by Satan. So what we're seeing here is the 30 and 40 is mentioned because it indicates the fulfillment, the prophetic fulfillment of things happening. In other words, also what we see here is that the number 40 is often used about testing and trials. And of course, Jesus has testing and trials, as we just talked about his temptation. Obviously, the 40 years of wandering. And there's many, many other 40s in the Bible that, if you look at them, indicate times of testing and trials. Make sense? Okay. Now, let's move on. Let's go back to our text. And let's move on and read verses 6, 7, and 8. A lot of terms here we're going to go through. It says, now the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, and they said to David, you shall not come in here, but the blind and lame shall turn you away, thinking to themselves, David cannot enter here. David cannot enter here. Paraphrase, he can't possibly succeed at conquering this place. Okay? That's what they're saying. Now, we'll read verse 7. Nevertheless, David captured the stronghold of Zion. We need to figure out what Zion is. That is the city of David. We need to figure out what the city of David is. And David said on that day, whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him reach the lame and the blind, quote unquote. This is actually sarcasm on David's part, in a way. Next week, I'm going to make that more clear. All right. Who are, quote, hated by David's soul. I'll make that more clear next week. Therefore, they say the blind or the lame shall not come into the house. I'll make that more clear next week. Okay. Now, why is this important? You should put a circle around this verse. It is an incredibly significant event. Let me show you why it's an incredibly significant event. It is an event unique and important to Jewish history. They get a capital called Jerusalem. Okay. It's also predominant in Middle East history, because what goes on in era after era then about this place called Jerusalem, empires try to conquer it, all through it. The Jews have it, the Jews lose it, the Jews regain it, the Jews get it again, okay, all through history. And it's extremely important in prophetic history. Let me give you some verses. You're going to have to move around in your Bible here a little bit. Let me give you first, I want to go to Zechariah. So, right at the almost end of the Old Testament, right before Malachi, the very last Old Testament book is Zechariah. And I want to look at two passages here. The first one is in chapter 8. And I hope you'll get the idea why this event is so important. Okay? It's verse 3, I believe. Let me see. Yeah, verse 3 of chapter 8. Thus says the Lord, I will return to Zion, and I will dwell in the midst of Jerusalem. Then Jerusalem will be called the city of truth, and the mountains of the Lord of hosts will be called the holy mountains. Now, this is prophetic of what's going to occur in the future, but what's the point? What starts here at this time around 950 BC with David is going to be an event that is the gaining of Jerusalem that will wind its way all the way in the prophetic future till the time that Messiah comes. And where does he end up coming to? As in Revelation 19, when he finally finishes his 200-mile traverse, he ends up where? Finally, in Jerusalem, to save a portion of the Jewish people from annihilation. So, pretty important place. All right, let's go to another text here. I want to go to the 12th chapter of Zechariah. So a few pages to the right. I want to look at several verses. We'll start in verse 2. Zechariah 12. Behold, I'm going to make Jerusalem a cup that causes reeling. Interesting word in the Hebrew. It means intoxication. Okay? Or passion as a result of intoxication. To all the peoples around. And when the siege is against Jerusalem, it will also be against Judah. So what's he saying? That all the nations, when Messiah returns, are going to be drug, intoxicated, stumbling to Jerusalem. Make sense? Okay, and next one, verse 3. And it will come about in that day that I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone. In other words, it's going to be an absolute horrible burden to the nations that come into it. Why is it going to be a heavy stone and burden? What's Messiah going to do to them when they come? He's going to annihilate their militaries. Okay, that's a pretty heavy stone. All right, boom, annihilation. For all the peoples, and all who lift it will be severely injured, and the nations of the earth will be gathered against it. Again, prophetically, a real important place. Drop down a couple verses to verses 9 and 10. And it will come about in that day that I will set about to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. Verse 10, and I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication, so that they will look on me whom they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son, and they will weep bitterly over him like the bitter weeping over a firstborn. And in that day, verse 11, we'll even read, there will be great mourning in Jerusalem, like the mourning of Hadadarim Mon in the plains of Megiddo, that is Armageddon. So again, important things happen in this place called Jerusalem. Let's turn to another verse, okay? Let's go to Psalm 122. So go back to your left. Maybe I'm belaboring this with you too much, but I want to show you the utter importance of Jerusalem, and therefore the utter importance of this event that we're literally reading about here in 2 Samuel 5. So Psalm 122. Oh, not a little too far there. And we want to look at, when I get there, okay, we want to look at verses 3 through 5. Okay, let's see if I have this right. Jerusalem, that is built as a city, that is compact together, which is a very interesting statement based on what we're going to study here in a few minutes. Think of that word, which is compact together. You're going to see that it starts out being compact, and you're going to see that it ends up being expanded. Very prophetic idea here. Verse 4, to which the tribes go up, even the tribes of the Lord. Therefore, another reason why Jerusalem is important. During festival times, what happens? They all go to Jerusalem, okay? And then he says it, an ordinance for Israel, that is the festival times are an ordinance, to give thanks in the name of the Lord, for these thrones were set up for judgment, the thrones of the house of David. So Jerusalem's going to also be associated with this idea of the house of David. It's going to be associated with the literal house of David, and also the bigger meaning of the house of David, which also includes ultimately Jesus' birth. What is Jesus called? He's called the son of the house of David. Okay. Now turn 3 Psalms to your right to Psalm 125. First, verse 1, especially. Those who trust in the Lord are as Mount Zion. We're going to define that, which cannot be moved, but abides forever. Why can't it be moved? Why can't Zion be moved? Any idea?
Because the Lord deemed that it wouldn't be.
because there are so many events that are going to occur, not even, I mean, especially eventually, not long after this time we're studying, the building of the temple there in that area, okay? And therefore, it's a critical place inside Jerusalem that needs to have a permanent and will have a permanent quality to it. Verse 2, as the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Some of us have been to Jerusalem, have been to Israel, and if you have been there, you realize that Jerusalem sits on the top of a mountain, about 3,000, almost 3,000 feet high in elevation. Okay, but it sits in a place where there are peaks in this area, yeah, and there also are valleys in this area that we're going to talk about. And the top of it, Mount Zion, in this area, I'm going to, well, maybe, well, actually, if you go to map 2, okay, you can see it for yourself. I'm going to try to hold this up and see how well this can be seen. This is what I'm calling map 2. I'll hold it here for a little bit. Notice some of the places, and notice the very north end there. It's kind of circular. All right. Now, that is called Mount Moriah. There's another famous place in antiquity called the threshing floor of Araunah. Okay. This is a place that David ends up buying from this guy, Araunah. Okay. And he builds an altar there, but even in the past, it's an important place because this is also the place where Isaac was bound and almost sacrificed to the Lord. Okay. Now, also, we see just a little bit to the left of the threshing floor, this rock area where later the temple is built. And it's all in this kind of elevated mound area called Mount Moriah. Okay. Now, as you move to the south, all right, you go down further to this place called the City of David. Do you see it?
Yeah.
Okay. You see that David built a palace on the north end of it. Okay. And if you look also to the east side, okay, or you see that there's obviously the walls of Jerusalem here. Mm-hmm. Now, remember something. The walls that we're going to start to talk about of this Jebusite city are way smaller than the walls of Jerusalem. Okay? It's a much smaller place to begin with. After David conquers this Jebusite city that is then named Jerusalem, right? Then he does all kinds of building projects, the expansion of walls, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. There's also something that we're going to spend some time on a little bit later that I hope you find interesting, and it's on the east side. You see this rock-cut pool. You see there Spring Tower in Gihon Springs. This is a place where springs run out of underneath an area of Jerusalem, and they run into this pool, Gihon Pool, which later during Jesus' time is called the Pool of Siloam. Okay? To the east side here, again, I'll hold this up, to the very east side of the map, okay, where my fingers are, this whole area is called the Kidron Valley. Okay, you go from the walls down into the valley, and then you move up the other side, and there would be the Mount of Olives. Okay, now the ancient city starts around this area, the Jebusite city. Okay, And what happens is, after they conquer it, there are building things that go on that begin to expand it. Now, I want to show you a map here, map number 1. And I'll try to see if I can get this on here. It's kind of dark, unfortunately. But if you can see it, this is a rendition of the original Jebusite city. This is what it looked like, we think, when David conquers it. Okay? And you'll see here that the original Jebusite palace, you'll see the marking there on your left. Okay, and we see that there is this area at the north that is called, it's put on here, it's called Ophel. But that's really not its original name. Its original name, if we go back to our text in 2 Samuel 5, okay, its original name in verse 9 is called, he says, and David built all around from the Millo. Okay. Actually, this area just north of the original Jebusite city is called the Millo. Millo means a terrace or an expanded area of ground, right? And what happens is that after they take the city, David starts to have houses built in the Millo. And then later, what they do is they expand the walls of the original Jebusite city north to the north and around and down to the northeast and southwest. And so the Millo eventually becomes inside the new city walls, but it's outside the old Jebusite city walls. You get the idea why I'm trying to explain this to you? There's a lot of topographic stuff and names of places that I think I need to take time to try to get you to understand.
Question.
Yes.
Please, how Jebusites happen to?
Well, I'm going to go over that. It's a good question. So let me talk about that for a minute. Okay. Now, let me go back for a second and say something else. David and his men realize, as they're deciding to go to this place called the Jebusite city, they realize that they cannot make the capital of a united Israel at Hebron any more than they can make it at Gibeah, where Saul came from. They must pick a neutral site. And they pick a place. I didn't give you a whole map of Israel, but they pick a place that is pretty much central in the whole territory of Israel and really kind of sits very much on the edge between the north and the south. In other words, it's territorially an ideal place. It's a neutral site. Remember, no Jew has essentially lived there. It's a Jebusite city. Okay? So it doesn't have any real history in that sense with any of the Jews. Does it make sense? Okay, now, so there's no tribal prejudice associated with making this place the capital called Jerusalem. Now, interestingly enough, the name Jerusalem, spoken of eventually, I mean, in the Hebrew, its original form linguistically is not Hebrew. When you go back to these ancient documents, these ancient cuneiform documents called the Elba tablets. The Elba tablets are clay tablets that are dated back to around 3000 BC. Yeah, old. And they are of this culture called the Akkadian culture, and they are in the Akkadian language. And inside these tablets, as archaeologists have and linguists have decoded them, we see that they talk about this place called Jerusalem. So they knew of this place that they called this ancient name. But originally it was an Akkadian name that then was translated later when Hebrew became the language. Because during the Akkadian times, 3000, 3500 BC, Hebrew hadn't been developed yet. Okay? It's like Abraham. Abraham didn't speak Hebrew because where's he come from? Mesopotamia. Okay? So he speaks the Sumerian language there. So it's later, but isn't it interesting, going back to over 3000 BC, this place and a map of it literally is mentioned by the Akkadian people. So it's a very ancient city, very ancient. So the Akkadian word for Jerusalem that we call Jerusalem means the foundation of God, that is the God named Shalem. The foundation of the God named Shalem. Now, turn, if you would, to Genesis chapter 14. I want to make a connection here. This has been a kind of a mysterious section of the Bible, I think, for a lot of people. Genesis 14, and we're going to start in verse 18. There's been a battle. 5 kings against, I believe, 5 kings. Abraham is the leader. The battle is won. And then all of a sudden, verse 18, in Melchizedek, king of the Shalem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High. Right? That is, this person who's a king and priest of a city called Shalem, who worshiped a god named El Elyon, which in Hebrew means the Most High God. That's the translation we have, priest of the Most High God, El Elyon. Do you see the connection? This guy is kind of, what we believe is the pre-incarnate Messiah. You know, this figure shows up in this unique place. This place is the ancient city of Jerusalem. Make sense? Okay, very ancient. Ancient before this time. But this, obviously, the fact that this interesting figure shows up, we got to pay attention to the fact where he is. He is the king or ruler of Jerusalem, or in the Akkadian, Shalem. Okay? All right.
What's the first part of the word? Jerusalem.
I think it refers to the God of the place of Shalem. Peace, right. Now, remember also that Abraham, as I said, came from Mesopotamia. He did not speak Hebrew. He spoke Sumerian. We date Abraham, I think, fairly accurately, right around 2200 BC. Now think about it. He ends up coming to this land, but over 1300 years, maybe before, it was already known as a place for the city called Jerusalem. Okay? It's ancient. So he obviously leaves Mesopotamia and comes to this land. It's collectively called Canaan, Canaanite territory. And he comes there because he becomes introduced and learns about and learns to talk to this God called Yahweh. He didn't know Yahweh until Yahweh spoke to him while he was in Mesopotamia. Now, am I making sense to you? I'm trying to put some things together for you to give you a comprehensive view. Turn to Judges chapter 19. Judges 19. Again, continuing to try to give you the history of Jerusalem. Judges 19, and we'll look at verse 10. So it's talking about this, the reason for what we call the Benjamite War, the man who had a concubine, and the story we went through. So verse 10, but the man was not willing to spend the night, so he arose and departed and came to a place opposite Jebus, that is Jerusalem, and there were him a pair of saddle donkeys, and his concubine was with him. So even back in that era, in the era of the Judges, which would have been, 1400 BC or so, obviously this Jebusite city was well known. Okay? Now, and again, it's the home of these people called the Jebus, and that's why the place is called the Jebusite city. The Jebusites, from what we can tell in archaeology, easily lived in this walled city they created for 400 to 500 years. Now think about that. That's like twice as long as this country has existed. And in all that time, no one conquered them. Does it make more sense then why they said what they said in 2 Samuel 5 when they say, even the lame and the blind can defend this place? In other words, you don't have a chance.
Position.
Right. We are on the top of a hill with steep ravines on three sides. Okay. We have this walled city we built on the top of this area, and you're not going to win. That's basically what they say to David and his men. I also want you to notice a couple other references. In Judges also, go to chapter 1 of Judges. Should have probably had you go there first, but we also see in verse 21, but the sons of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. The Jebusites have lived with the sons of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. In other words, they lived around the city, but couldn't conquer it. So the Jebusites were able to maintain their city and their area, even though during this time it technically was in the territory, obviously, of the Benjamites. All right. Now, also, I want you to notice another reference, and we're going to have to go to the right to 1 Chronicles. So all the way to the right, and we're going to go to chapter 11. 1 Chronicles 11 is a very useful and important summary about these events. We're going to start in verse 4. This is also a recounting of the capture of Jerusalem, but it has more elements in it than 2 Samuel 5 has. 2 Samuel 5 just says, and they went to the Jebusite city called Jerusalem and they conquered it. Okay? But this kind of gives you more information. So starting verse 4 of 1 Chronicles 11, and David and all Israel went to Jerusalem, that is Jebus, Jebusites. The inhabitants of the land were there, Jebusites. Verse 5, and the inhabitants of Jebus said to David, you shall not enter here. Nevertheless, David captured the stronghold of Zion. We have to talk a little bit about what is Zion, and also the city of David. Verse 6, now David had said, whoever strikes down a Jebusite first shall be chief and commander. In other words, he's making a reward here. If you can figure out how to conquer this place, which nobody's conquered for 400 to 500 years, whoever has this great strategic idea, you can be commander of my troops from then on. So what happens? Okay, and Joab, the son of Zeruiah, went up first, so he became chief. So Joab somehow figures out, and we're going to talk in a minute about how, he somehow figures out how to do this. It's very interesting. It says, verse 7, then David dwelt in the stronghold, therefore it was called the city of David. I already showed you in the map where the city of David is, okay? It's south of the original Jebusite walls. And he built the city all around from the Millo, I already talked about that, which was that terraced area north of the old Jebusite town, okay? Even in the surrounding area, and Joab repaired the rest of the city. You see, after they conquer it, there's a whole series of building projects that go on in this area. They expand it out. And David therefore became greater and greater, for the Lord of hosts was with him. Okay. Now, let's take some of these areas and talk about them a little bit. So, the top of the mountain range, as I've talked about, is called, or is Mount Moriah. Okay. It is, as we said, surrounded by valleys on three sides. And over time, the original Jebusite walls were expanded significantly by the Jews, by Joab and these building projects into a much larger area. You see that in map number 2. Okay, you can see here again, hopefully, in map 2, that they expand a little bit to the north from the Millo, or what is there. Well, it's actually that map doesn't have the Millo on it, but they start to expand it to the south. And as they expand it to the south, that's what's called the city of David. Now, there's further expansions also. And over time, especially during the time of Solomon, they even build more to the south and incorporate, I believe, more into what's called the city of David. Okay, now, Mount Moriah in that area is also termed Zion. It's on this highest hill, and it's inside this original Jebusite walled city. Okay. And as I just showed you in the map, the city of David is expanded to the south of, and the walls also are expanded out. And as I said, to the east side of this map number 2, though it's not, it's not marked there, but where my fingers are on this map is the Kidron Valley. And on the other side of the Kidron Valley is obviously the Mount of Olives. Now, David originally lived inside the walled city. Okay, you see it on the map. He was developed, the city of David. But we see that from the original Jebusite city, that is map number 1 again, all right, they end up expanding to the north and to the northeast, and eventually also to the south. And we see there that that there are homes built in that area of the northeast, and also, as I said, a bigger walled system. As I said, the Millo that's mentioned to the north is renamed later Ophel. And they not only rename it, that area to the northeast, okay, the Ophel originally would have been kind of up here to the, and over here to the northeast where my finger is, okay? And then they start to expand it over time down, and it comes down into the side of the west side of what's called the Kidron Valley, in that area just outside and around the walls of the eastern side of Jerusalem. Am I making sense on this map? Okay. Now, we see mention of this area called the Ophel. Would you turn to, from where we were sitting here in 1 Chronicles 11, go to 2 Chronicles 27. I want to show you all these places are defined and discussed in the Bible. So 2 Chronicles 27. Verse 3. Remember, there's constant building projects that are going on after David conquers this. All through the rest of his 33 years of reign. Building projects, building projects, building projects. Okay? It says, he built the upper gate of the house of God, and he built extensively the wall of Ophel. So what happens is that over time, that the Ophel, as they build more from the northeast down to the south, they end up building part of it. There's a wall area that they build also there. So there's constant kind of redoing of these things. Also, if you want to turn to, see, that was 2 Chronicles 27. If you want to turn over to 2 Chronicles 33, and look at verse 14, I believe, of 2 Chronicles 33. Oops, I'm 32. Yeah, you go far enough. Verse 14. Verse 14 of 2 Chronicles 33, it says, now after this, he built the outer wall of the city of David on the west side of Gihon. Gihon is the spring area. Again, let me point to it on this map number 2. If I can, let me put my finger there. Okay. This area is the Gihon. That is, it's a spring that comes out of underneath what is called Jerusalem. And then it says, on the west side of Gihon, in the valley, even to the entrance of the fish gate, and he encircled the Ophel with it and made it very high. So they construct walls around this area. Okay. And then it says he put army commanders in all the fortified cities. So he turns that Ophel area, as they build it, into a military area also. Now, it says, as we read in 1 Chronicles 11, 4-9, that Joab finds a way to gain entrance to the Jebusite city. How does he do it? He does it through this area called the Gihon Spring. Now let me talk about this for a minute, and I'll finish with this. The Gihon Spring, as I pointed out in the map, is on the east side. The exit of the Gihon Spring, let's say, is on the east side of the walls of Jerusalem. It is on it's on the west side of the Kidron Valley, and it's a small natural shaft. It's eroded by water. One of the things you have to understand about Jerusalem is that this mount area that it sits on is all limestone. And you have water, our hydrologist is here, you have water over thousands of years penetrating down from rain through this area, and it erodes out eventually a shaft. This shaft was archaeologically excavated in 1867 by Sir Charles Warren, and he explores it, and they kind of go through and kind of widen it a little bit to get through it. And of course, he calls it Warren's Shaft, okay? Not humbly after his own name, but it's really the Gihon Spring Shaft. an original shaft, okay? When it's measured, well, by the way, Gihon means rushing water or gushing water, okay? When Morin measures it, this little tunnel is 41 meters long, so it's only about, what, 130 feet-ish, okay? It is about 2.5 to 3 meters wide, and it descends from its area about 13 meters to where, in height, to where it comes out on the Gihon Spring area. Now, I want you to turn to map number 3. Okay, here's map number 3. Hopefully it can be seen well enough. It is a diagram that shows you, and I'll talk about it, that there actually are 3 shafts that occur underneath the city of Jerusalem. 2 of them actually exist around, well, within 200 years of David's time. The original was what we call the Shalom shaft, okay? Or Warren shaft, if you want to put it that way. I marked it, I marked it on my map. I'm sorry, I didn't do this to you, but I'm going to show you guys. It would be the shaft number 1. Do you see where I marked number 1 in that upper corner?
Yeah.
Okay, that is a shaft. Now, this is a side view. I'm sorry, I'm going to move this over. This cut is a side view, so it shows you here the Jebusite walls, but on end, okay? So it's a little bit more challenging. But what happens is, right up here, where I've got my finger, okay? Right up here is the original entrance. And it flows down over to an area to the southeast, okay? It's really not that long, but it ends up, there's an access point inside the original Jebusite walled city. This is how the Jebusites get their water, okay? So Joab figures out the entrance, and he starts to sneak soldiers through this shaft and accumulate them in there until they burst out at one point, undoubtedly, I would think at nighttime, and through that, they take the city. So it's an interesting historical and geological story there. So that's how they conquer the city.
Did they have to take it house by house,
Probably.
given the size of what
Yeah.
they're showing?
Now, it's a relatively small area, the Jebusite city, compared to the later walls of Jerusalem. But still, I mean, it almost reminds you, in a way, of the story later on of how Babylon is conquered, I mean, all of a sudden, they find this entrance under the Euphrates River to it, and one night, boom, Babylon is taken over by Persia,
They dammed the water though.
Yeah, they dammed the water. They had to do some work there. But it's almost kind of a somewhat parallel here, because they find this entrance and they exploit it, and this is the weak point, Obviously, the Jebusites didn't probably consider it a weak point because it's where they got water. But it obviously was an entrance, and they gain access. Now, there is a later tunnel. It's a second tunnel, and it's called let me make certain here. It's called the Siloam Channel, and it was cut and expanded and runs about 400 meters to the south and emerges on the southeast slope of the city of David. And this is where let me go. That's number 2. Where I marked number 2 here. Okay, that's the second water tunnel that was developed and comes out on the east side of Jerusalem there on the walls, and later is called the Pool of Siloam during Jesus' time. Okay, now there is a third tunnel, a third waterway that is built as a result of the efforts about 800 BC of King Hezekiah. And it is an absolutely remarkable tunnel. And we see that it was developed by Hezekiah and his engineers. It's cut through limestone rock beneath this City of David area. It is 533 meters long. That's what, 1700 feet, around there, okay? It averages about 2 meters wide and maybe 2-ish tall, 2.5 maybe meters tall, around there, okay? And we see, interestingly, a mention of it. I'm going to turn here. The mention is in 2 Kings 20:20. Let me read it to you. It's the biblical mention of this area. Now the rest of the acts of Hezekiah and all his might, and how he made the pool and the conduit and brought water into the city, are they not written in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Judah? So here's the historical reference that's saying, this was done and engineered under Hezekiah. Now, the thing that's amazing about this is if you read more about it, they started with 2 teams of excavators who started on opposite ends of this tunnel. Again, notice this tunnel is on the very south. It's down here, and it comes out here. Okay, and they travel this 16 or 1700 feet, chiseling out limestone rock the entire way. And you're going to have to tell me how they engineered this thing, that over that period of time, they met each other within 6 inches of accuracy and broke through from either side.
Quite amazing.
Unbelievable. That's what happened.
No, they had satellites up, they had GPS, they had.
That's right. They had lasers,
Real-
yeah, all that stuff, right.
Explainable.
Make certain to cover the topography accurately, yeah. So, at any rate, interestingly, I don't know if you saw this. Gary, do you want to, here's a little shot of the Hezekiah Tunnel, this top picture, just one example of it. But you guys were there.
Yeah, we were inside the tunnel.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about it? Because I was not in that tunnel.
Did you go down? Yeah.
Okay,
Started down by the spring.
Yeah,
On the
on the-
steps.
We waded water ankle deep the entire length of the tunnel.
okay,
And, before I went in, I took my shoes off. I had tennis shoes and I didn't wear tennis shoes for the rest of the day and walked through in socks. But it was
ew,
narrow enough that you had to be careful that you couldn't walk too wide. You had one,
Single file.
and it was dark. There was no lights except a flashlight. One of the group had a flashlight, and it was a bit claustrophobic. 1,700 feet.
Yeah. Kept
And
thinking that was
you're-
gonna move.
Yeah, it was interesting, but I think we started singing hymns there for a while.
to occupy yourself against the claustrophobia.
Right, sounds like.
But it was just amazing, as Tim said, to see how accurate they were when they came in from 2 different sides. And you could actually see the offset in the tunnel. And they, how did they do that?
Okay, now, here's something, I don't know if you saw it. Yeah.
Must be.
Here's something, I don't know if you saw it, but that place where they met, those teams inscribed on the walls of the tunnel about meeting there.
Right.
You see that inscription? Yeah, you can go there today and see the same inscription that they inscribed on that wall area where they met around 800-ish or so BC.
Quite an engineering feat.
So,
You think about all the building they did.
That's an engineering.
It is.
And think of the tools they have compared to what we have today.
And it lasts
Yeah.
compared to what we have today.
That is true. So at any rate,
Broad City.
I'm only covering about 8 verses. We'll take off from here because I needed to try to get you to understand what Jerusalem was like. It's a very ancient, very complex, very archaeological, very engineered, built over years and years, redone, up until then we see it in the Gospels during the time of Jesus.
And the
Okay,
Jebusites were there in Genesis. Genesis 10
yes, yeah.
mentions them.
They are a very ancient people, Canaanite people, okay? But again, what I'm trying to get you to understand, and hopefully I did, is the importance of this verse in 2 Samuel 5, where it says, and they went to the Jebusite city to take it. This is a key moment in Jewish history that starts a whole run of historical events through the rest of the Bible. So,
Let me come back to the water, just
yes,
on Mount Olives. Christ returns and his foot touches the mountain. Mount Olives literally splits east to west,
great earthquake,
big earthquake.
right?
And a river of water.
Rushes out.
There's water under what I think would be an arid desert type place. But there is water there. It amazed me how Mount Olives would literally split apart.
Also, think about it. Now, this is a huge, much bigger example of it. But if you want an example of what water can do to limestone, go to Mammoth Cave in Kentucky.
Yep.
That's how it occurred over thousands and thousands of years. Water trickled through. Yes,
So in Zechariah 4, says, in that day living waters will flow out of Jerusalem, half of them toward the eastern sea and the other half toward the western sea. Is that connected anyhow?
that's a good question. Obviously the Western Sea is the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
The Eastern Sea is
Dead Sea.
the Dead Sea fed by the Sea of Galilee.
Right.
Okay, so the question is, in the event that Gary just mentioned, does that end up in that earthquake somehow making a connector?
Something's gonna happen.
Something's gonna happen.
It will happen.
Yep,
Yeah.
it will happen.
It will happen.
But again, the absolute importance of this event when they conquered the Jebusite city, the ancient city called Jerusalem.
Oh, that was a big research.
All right, so we need to, Michael, would you pray to end us tonight?
It is, yeah, it is.
Heavenly Father, we do thank you for your word. Thank you that the descriptions in your word are there for our viewing, and then even the confirmation of it still
Mhm.
stands
Yes.
in so many places in the land where you walked lives and made such an impression on this entire world, Father. We thank you for your Son, Jesus. We thank you for what he means to us, Father, in our day, and God, for salvation that he purchased with his own. Pray now that you would just help us, Lord, as we walk in our lives, Lord. We would walk according to your will for our lives and go the way that you have prepared for us. I ask you to go with us now throughout the remainder of the week. So thank you. In Jesus' name.